A KKK killer grabbed Bumpy's wife. What Bumpy did next made 200 people stand completely still. The man's hand was on her, bold, careless. Harlem waited for the fight, for the gun, for blood. Bumpy didn't move fast. He moved in a way that made everyone freeze, uncertain. The morning was calm, ordinary, until a sudden, sharp disruption tore through the street. A man, face twisted with hatred, grabbed Bumpy's wife without warning, his hand firm, disrespectful, defiant. She struggled, eyes wide, but not in panic. Her trust in him was absolute. The onlookers froze, caught between instinct and disbelief. Time slowed. Every step Bumpy took toward them was deliberate, unhurried. He did not shout. He did not lunge. His eyes, calm and measured, never left the aggressor. The streets seemed to contract, the air thick with tension, as if Harlem itself was holding its breath. Murmurs began to ripple, spreading like a low current through the crowd. Neighbors, shopkeepers, children, men in suits and fedoras, all sensing that the expected violence might not come. The man holding her tightened his grip, misjudging the quiet before the storm. He believed fear required fury. He believed boldness demanded retaliation. He did not see Bumpy's power resting in restraint, in the confidence of a man who knows the value of stillness. Some turned their heads, unwilling to watch, yet unable to look away. Hands gripped door frames, railings, the edges of stoops. Phones, radios, or cameras were not needed. Every eye bore witness. Every heart recognized the weight of what was happening. Bumpy's approach was invisible, yet unmistakable. Each step carried authority. He didn't speak. The city spoke for him through the silence that had fallen. A lesson, unspoken, began to take form in the minds of 200 people who had stopped, mid-motion, mid-breath, unsure if they should intervene or wait. In that moment, it was clear violence might have been expected, but what was about to happen would not come from haste or anger. It would come from something far older, far quieter, far more powerful. The street outside Bumpy's brownstone had never felt so alive and still at the same time. Word had traveled fast, though no one had shouted, no one had run. Every face in Harlem seemed to pivot toward the unfolding scene. The man who dared to disrespect Bumpy's family and the calm figure approaching him with deliberate, unshakable intent. From stoops, window sills, and shop entrances, neighbors watched, their expressions unreadable but tense. A butcher paused mid-chop, hands frozen over the cleaver. A barber stopped mid-stroke, comb poised in air. Children peered around corners, sensing the gravity of something beyond their understanding. The air hummed with expectation. Each heartbeat in the crowd seemed synchronized with Bumpy's slow steps, each breath taken in silent coordination. The man clutching Bumpy's wife felt the weight of it too. He had intended to provoke fear, to assert dominance, to make a spectacle. But now, the eyes of the neighborhood pressed down on him like a physical force. His arrogance faltered. Sweat broke across his forehead. His grip loosened, then tightened again, trembling. For the first time, he realized that fear did not always demand shouting or violence. Sometimes it was the stillness, the calm that carried the promise of inevitable consequence. Bumpy moved with precision, his posture impeccable, every detail calculated. He did not raise his voice. He did not gesture angrily. His eyes scanned the man before him, appraising, silent, letting the tension swell to a level beyond spoken comprehension. From the crowd, no one intervened. Respect, loyalty, and understanding of the unspoken rules of Harlem held them in place. They knew that Bumpy's restraint was not weakness. It was power, deliberate and exacting. Each individual watching felt the weight of centuries of survival in the black community, the unspoken code of standing with those who commanded respect and justice without spectacle. As Bumpy reached the man's side, Time itself seemed to bend around the quiet authority he radiated. The streets, the buildings, the very city around them appeared to lean closer, listening for the inevitable, recognizing that something monumental was about to occur without a single shout or gunshot. The neighborhood collectively held its breath, poised, aware, silent. In Harlem that day, the lesson was already written. Control spoke louder than rage, and 200 eyes witnessed the balance of power shift without a word. The man who had grabbed Bumpy's wife finally noticed the rhythm of his own panic. His pulse raced, but Bumpy's approach was methodical, almost ceremonial. Each step measured, each breath controlled. The hum of Harlem around them seemed suspended, as though the city itself had paused to watch. Bumpy's eyes were steady. They did not flinch, they did not dart. He carried no weapon, yet the absence of threat somehow felt heavier than any gun in a man's hand. The crowd leaned in, forming a silent perimeter of judgment and witness. They had seen challenges before, but never with such absolute stillness. Every corner, every doorway held a pair of watchful eyes, yet no one moved. Even the children held their small bodies rigid, absorbing the weight of authority that radiated from Bumpy. The man who had thought himself clever, quick, violent, daring, began to notice the change. His confidence wavered. The bravado that had carried him this far crumbled under the suffocating calm of Bumpy's presence. He had expected rage, a fight, something theatrical. Instead, he was met with patience, with silence, and with the knowledge that the moment he tried to act, it would be on Bumpy's terms. Bumpy's wife remained close but unharmed, her expression taut yet trusting. She knew the rhythm, the subtle strength, that only he could project. Her faith in him was mirrored in the silent witness of the street. She did not cry, did not plead. She simply observed, understanding that the resolution was already being orchestrated. The man's hand twitched. He considered a move, a shove, a scream, but the collective eyes of Harlem were upon him. The neighborhood had trained him, silently, in the codes of respect and restraint, and now he was acutely aware of every potential consequence. A single misstep would not just draw Bumpy's wrath, it would draw the judgment of 200 witnesses who understood loyalty, power, and the order of things. Bumpy stopped a few feet from him. His body relaxed yet remained immovable. A subtle tilt of his head, the almost imperceptible narrowing of his eyes, communicated more than words ever could. The man's confidence withered. Sweat poured down his face. His jaw clenched. His hands dropped slightly, unconsciously surrendering to the control that Bumpy radiated. No gun had been drawn. No scream had pierced the air. The confrontation was complete, yet unfinished. The balance of power had shifted entirely. The neighborhood held its collective breath, frozen. And for the first time, the man understood that the hand that grabbed Bumpy's family was not the hand that would decide the outcome. That authority lay elsewhere. The streets of Harlem, once mere bystanders, had become witnesses to a lesson in calm, deliberate dominance. The man's fear was no longer theoretical. It was absolute, and it spoke louder than any act of violence ever could. The crowd did not move. Not a shuffle, not a murmur. Every person on that street, every figure leaning out of windows or peering from doorways, held still. Harlem had learned, in small ways and large, the meaning of restraint. Today, the lesson was visible, embodied in Bumpy's quiet dominance. Bumpy stood a few paces from a man who had dared to grab his wife. His posture was relaxed yet deliberate, a visual promise that the next move would not be rushed. His eyes, calm and unblinking, surveyed the onlookers as if measuring their understanding, confirming their allegiance. He did not need applause, nor acknowledgement. He simply existed in that space, and it was enough. The man before him shifted uncomfortably. His bravado had long since dissolved into a physical tension that made him look smaller than his stature suggested. He had expected fear to erupt in Bumpy's face, expected to meet anger in his fists. Instead, he was met with patience. Every silent step, every pause, reinforced a lesson harsher than any slap or shot could convey. Behind Bumpy, the street had become a living portrait of loyalty. Shopkeepers leaned on their counters, arms folded, faces impassive yet alert. Children stood frozen mid-step, observing in awe. The elderly, perched on stoops with hands clasped, conveyed through their stillness that the moment was understood. The message traveled without words. Power is not always loud, and authority does not need to strike to assert itself. The man's eyes darted briefly to the edges of the crowd, seeking support, an ally, or an escape route. But there were none. Every onlooker's gaze reinforced the hierarchy he had misjudged. The silence was heavier than a gun, more binding than any chain. In that frozen street, he was naked, exposed to the consequences of misunderstanding Bumpy's calm. Bumpy's wife remained by his side, her composure steady, a living testament to the order he upheld. She did not cling, did not plead. She simply observed, a mirror to the collective restraint of the neighborhood. Her presence added weight to the scene. The man realized that this was no longer a private matter, no longer a simple act of defiance. It had become a communal reckoning. The street itself seemed to lean in, the cracked pavement and brick facades silent witnesses to authority in its most subtle form. No sounds of car horns or footsteps interfered. Even the wind held its breath. The atmosphere was tense but controlled, the contrast of light and shadow making every figure stark, every glance sharp. Harlem was watching, but not just watching. It was participating, confirming the inevitability of the moment without a single word. Bumpy took a small step forward, deliberate but unhurried. The man's chest rose and fell rapidly, the first audible motion in a sea of stillness. His hands trembled. The crowd remained statuesque, unwavering. Bumpy's control was total, his presence absolute. Authority did not need to shout, it only needed to exist. And in that existence, the man's understanding of power shifted irreversibly. No gun had fired. No fist had met flesh. Yet the street had witnessed something far more enduring. It was a lesson in restraint, in community alignment, and in the kind of calm that demanded respect. The neighborhood would remember this silence, long after any shouted threats were forgotten. Bumpy stepped closer, each footfall measured, precise, carrying the weight of inevitability. The man who had dared to touch his wife froze, as if the street itself had conspired to hold him in place. Nothing about Bumpy's movement screamed violence. Yet every inch he closed shortened the distance between authority and submission, between threat and reckoning. His eyes met the man's, steady, unreadable, and absolute. No atrid, no panique, no tremor. Just control. A slow inhale, a pause, and the world seemed to bend to that stillness. The man's chest rose erratically, panic restrained by fear, confusion tangled with realization. In those moments, Bumpy needed no words. The silence carried the weight of consequence, a promise that this encounter was no longer negotiable. Hands at his sides, Bumpy's posture alone conveyed the magnitude of choice. He could act, he could strike, but restraint was more formidable. In this calm, deliberate dominance, he demonstrated power that violence could never match. Around him, the crowd's gaze was unwavering. Witnesses not to a spectacle, but to authority in its purest form. The tension was palpable, thick enough to taste, a quiet assertion that the street, the community, and morality itself were aligned with him. The man stammered, trying words that failed, gestures that faltered. His bravado had crumbled under the weight of stillness, and the world narrowed to Bumpy's composed figure, the umbrella at his side a subtle emblem of control. It had once been a symbol of threat, bloodied and provocative. Now it was a tool of dominance, silent yet unmistakable. Every eye on the street understood this transformation. Bumpy's voice broke the silence. Not raised, not sharp, but precise, cutting through only enough to clarify, not to yell, "Let her go." The words were not a command shouted in rage. They were a decree delivered from absolute authority. The man obeyed immediately, hands twitching, surrendering to the inevitability of consequence without resistance. In that frozen tableau, the power dynamic had shifted completely. What had begun as intimidation became revelation. The street, 200 strong, remained statuesque, recording a moment that would embed itself in Harlem's memory. The respect commanded here was not earned through violence. It was carved from patience, control, and the unspoken understanding that authority is a presence, not a roar. Bumpy's wife, freed and untouched, stepped closer, a silent acknowledgement of the resolution. Together, they moved with the quiet dignity of inevitability, leaving the man shaken, humiliated, and painfully aware that some forces cannot be bargained with. The street exhaled collectively, though no breath escaped. The lesson had been delivered, sharp, unforgettable, and utterly restrained. The umbrellas, the stoops, the brick walls, all witnesses, reflected the gravity of the moment. Harlem would carry this memory forward. Not the violence that had been threatened, but the calm dominance that had replaced it. Authority, when exercised with composure, left no room for defiance. The street emptied slowly, each step measured, as if Harlem itself were reluctant to release the moment. Conversations were hushed, heads nodded in acknowledgement, eyes lingering on Bumpy and his wife as they moved past. Nothing needed to be spoken. The lesson had been etched into the air, carried by respect, fear, and recognition of authority. Bumpy's calm presence lingered long after he walked away. Children paused mid-play. Shopkeepers straightened instinctively, and even those with no direct stake felt the invisible weight of what had just occurred. It was not violence that commanded obedience. It was restraint, decisiveness, and the understanding that some men define consequences simply by existing within a room. The man who had dared to touch his wife vanished into the shadows, a shadow of his former arrogance. His hands shook, his gait uneven, every movement a reminder of the silent force that had undone him. Rumors would swirl, whispers of what had happened, but the story carried a moral that transcended gossip. Authority exercised with control surpasses brute strength every time. In the days that followed, loyalty consolidated. Neighborhood eyes watched, silently measuring, learning, aligning. Bumpy's reputation deepened, not through fear or bloodshed, but through the quiet, unassailable power of calm. Respect was given freely to those who had earned it, and Bumpy had reminded everyone how that respect must be maintained, with precision, patience, and principle. Even those outside Harlem heard of the event, carried by word of mouth and the reverence of those who had witnessed it firsthand. The lesson was universal: power without rage, control without spectacle, and justice without chaos. It was a legacy that endured because it relied not on stories of violence, but on the unwavering authority of a man who needed no theatrics to command a room. By nightfall, Harlem's rhythm returned. Life resumed its natural pace, but the memory remained, anchored in stone stoops, lampposts, and the quiet nods of those who knew the streets had been forever reminded who held the ultimate authority. Bumpy Johnson had taught them once again: dominance is measured in silence, and true power is never rushed.